The gavel's echo had barely faded when the courtroom air seemed to tighten, every breath heavy, every glance sharp with anticipation. Cameras clicked like restless insects, capturing history in motion. The nation had tuned in, waiting for routine. Legal sparring, but what unfolded was something no one dared predict. In the front row, journalists leaned forward, pens frozen above their notepads. Across the aisle, murmurs swelled as the crowd braced for another dry exchange of legal jargon. But then, like a scene torn from the climax of a thriller, Tom Cruise rose from his chair. His posture carried the weight of defiance, and his eyes, locked onto the bench with a fire that made the room tremble. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cutting clean through the silence. A hush fell so complete it drowned out even the buzz of the fluorescent lights. "With all due respect, Judge America deserves the truth." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the chamber, some stifled, others sharp and unrestrained. Court officers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment breathe. Even the reporters, hardened by years of political theater, felt their chests tighten. On the bench, Judge Clarence Thomas blinked slowly, his expression betraying nothing yet revealing everything. For a man accustomed to deference, the sudden challenge was more than disruption, it was desecration. The crowd felt it too, a collective shiver of disbelief that someone, anyone, would dare break the unwritten rules of power in such a hallowed room. Tom didn't flinch. His jaw tightened as though he had rehearsed this moment for years, carrying the grievances of millions on his shoulders. In that instant, he was no actor, no celebrity. He was a vessel of righteous fury, demanding that shadows be pierced by light. Every eye turned, every breath synced, every second stretched into eternity. The confrontation had only begun, but already the air crackled with the electricity of rebellion. The spectators, the press, the nation, they leaned closer, desperate, to see whether the man standing against the bench of power would ignite a fire too bright to contain. This was no movie set. No director sat in a chair yelling, "Cut." No cameras waiting for a second take. The walls were not painted plywood props, but stone and marble that had borne witness to generations of rulings, shaping the fate of millions. Every heartbeat inside that courtroom pulsed with the knowledge that what was unfolding wasn't spectacle. It was history. Clarence Thomas sat on the bench, cloaked in authority, his robe a symbol of the power he had carried for decades. To his supporters, he was untouchable, a man whose word could bend the course of law. But to countless Americans, he had become the embodiment of everything corrosive in the system. Hypocrisy dressed as wisdom, favoritism cloaked as principle, corruption masquerading as tradition. He was the symbol of a system where the rules were bent to protect the powerful while the powerless were told to wait their turn. And there, facing him, stood Tom Cruise, not as an actor chasing applause, but as a man unafraid to risk everything for a simple, uncompromising truth. He was the outsider who refused to bow, the voice that cut through the heavy veil of silence. In that moment, Cruise wasn't fighting just for himself. He was carrying the anger of veterans who felt abandoned, immigrants who felt unseen, and everyday citizens who were sick of being told to sit quietly while justice bent in favor of the elite. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't about celebrity versus judge. It was about whether truth still had a place in America's most sacred chambers. The crowd knew it. The reporters knew it. And deep down, even Clarence Thomas knew it. Every word, every pause, every glance was charged with the weight of democracy itself. The room wasn't just listening to a man speak, was witnessing a battle between two visions of America, one clinging to secrecy and power, the other daring to demand dignity and accountability. And then came the anticipation. People whispered, leaning toward each other, "Did you hear what he's about to say?" A buzz swept the gallery, a restless energy that made palms sweat and hearts pound. They could feel it. A single line was building, the kind of line that would break past the walls of the courtroom, blast across television screens, and echo in history books. A line not rehearsed, not scripted, but born from the raw collision of courage and truth. The crowd braced for it, even before the words were spoken. They could sense the shift, the way silence stretched taut like a bowstring about to snap, because everyone knew instinctively there would be a sentence, just one, that would not only silence Clarence Thomas, but bring the entire courtroom to tears. Asterisk for decades. Clarence Thomas projected an image of stoic authority. To some, he was the quiet justice, rarely speaking during oral arguments, letting his opinions do the talking. But beneath that silence lay a record riddled with contradictions, controversies, and choices that left ordinary Americans questioning whose side he was truly on. His story had once been framed as an emblem of triumph rising from poverty in Georgia, raised by a strict grandfather, pushing through adversity to reach the Supreme Court. That narrative, polished and repeated, gave him the aura of a man who understood hardship, who knew what it meant to claw one's way from the bottom. But over time, the reality began to split from the myth. Instead of standing as a champion for those who shared his struggles, Thomas too often aligned himself with the very structures that kept power concentrated in the hands of a few. The first fracture in the facade came with his confirmation hearings. The nation watched as Anita Hill's testimony shook the Senate chamber, her voice unwavering as she detailed allegations of harassment that painted Thomas as anything but honorable. He denied it all, calling it a high-tech lynching, flipping the narrative into one of victimhood. For some, his defense resonated. For others, it was the first sign of a man willing to twist truth into armor, willing to weaponize identity to shield himself from accountability. Years passed, and more controversies piled up. Reports surfaced of his failure to disclose lavish gifts and luxury trips funded by wealthy benefactors with interests before the very court where he sat in judgment, where ordinary Americans were held to account for every dollar, every misstep. Clarence Thomas seemed untouchable. The rules bent around him like branches bowing to the weight of privilege, and yet he carried himself with the air of indifference, as though the people raising these questions were beneath him. His opinions often struck like hammers against the vulnerable, limiting voting rights, dismissing protections for marginalized communities, siding with corporations over individuals. Each ruling was another reminder that the man who had risen from poverty now stood far removed from those still trapped in it. But perhaps the most striking contradiction was his silence. For years, Thomas rarely spoke during hearings, a figure cloaked in mystery. Critics saw it not as wisdom, but as arrogance, as though he considered the questions and struggles of others unworthy of his voice. When he did speak, it was often to defend positions that reinforced power rather than challenge it. The humility of his beginnings had curdled into the distance of a man who believed himself above scrutiny, and through it all, the system protected him. Senators closed ranks. Political allies shielded him. Media cycles moved on, again and again. Clarence Thomas emerged unscathed, untouchable. the very picture of an institution too insulated to be challenged. But the discontent simmered. Each revelation, each ruling, each contradiction chipped away at the public's patience. He had become a symbol not of justice, but of injustice, the embodiment of what happened when accountability disappeared behind marble walls. Still, Thomas remained unmoved. His expression rarely shifted, his voice rarely betrayed doubt. He believed in the durability of his position, in the loyalty of those who propped him up, in the power of tradition to keep him safe. To him, the controversies were background noise, fleeting storms that would always pass. Asterisk to most of the world. Tom Cruise is a movie star, the million-watt smile, the impossible stunts, the blockbuster films that dominate theaters every summer. But beneath the glitz of Hollywood lies a story shaped not by privilege, but by hardship, grit, and an unshakable determination to overcome. His presence in that courtroom was no accident. It was the culmination of a life defined by resilience. Born in Syracuse, New York, in 1962, Cruise grew up in a family that knew struggle. His father was an electrical engineer, but also an unstable presence, prone to anger and unreliability. Money was tight. His mother worked tirelessly to hold the family together, but Tom learned early that life wasn't going to hand him anything. Dyslexia made school a daily battle, words on the page swimming before his eyes while classmates advanced without him. Teachers wrote him off. He was told he wasn't smart enough, wasn't capable enough, wasn't destined for much at all. But that doubt became fuel. Cruise refused to be defined by limitations. He threw himself into sports, then into performance, learning, discipline, and focus not as luxuries but as survival tools. When his parents divorced, he felt the weight of instability once again, but instead of breaking, he doubled down on his drive to succeed. Acting wasn't just a career choice. It was an escape, a chance to prove everyone wrong, a chance to turn pain into power. Hollywood, of course, remembers him as the star of Risky Business, Top Gun, and a dozen other icons of cinema. But the role that cemented him in the American imagination wasn't a pilot or a spy, it was Lieutenant Daniel Coffey in A Few Good Men. In that film, Cruise played the young lawyer who stood up to power, who refused to be silenced, who demanded the truth from a hardened general. The climactic line, "You can't handle the truth," became etched into pop culture forever. It was fiction, yes, but it carried the resonance of something deeper. It showed Cruise not just as an actor, but as a man who could embody courage, who could channel the voice of ordinary people standing against corruption, and off-screen, that same intensity carried through. Colleagues spoke of his tireless work ethic, his demand for perfection, his willingness to put himself on the line, whether clinging to airplanes mid-flight or mastering complicated choreography with relentless precision. For Cruise, discipline wasn't optional. It was who he was. That background mattered now, in this courtroom. Unlike Clarence Thomas, who seemed insulated by his position, Cruise had walked through storms of doubt and failure. He knew what it was to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be told he wasn't good enough. That personal history, that raw hunger to prove himself, made him uniquely equipped to stare down hypocrisy to millions watching. Cruise represented something bigger than fame. He was the embodiment of perseverance, of resilience against impossible odds. He had turned weakness into strength, rejection into fuel, obstacles into stepping stones. He wasn't just an actor, he was a mirror of what ordinary people aspired to. The belief that you could rise above, that truth could prevail, that no authority was too powerful to be challenged. And so, when he walked into that courtroom, it Wasn't Tom Cruise the movie star who entered it? Was Tom Cruise the fighter, the survivor, the voice forged in adversity? Asterisk, the courtroom had the electricity of a live wire, humming with anticipation. Every set of eyes was fixed on the unlikely duel playing out before them. Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, cloaked in decades of authority, and Tom Cruise, the Hollywood icon turned moral lightning rod. At first glance, it seemed absurd, one of the most powerful figures in American law pitted against an actor. But within minutes, the tension was undeniable. This wasn't theater. This was real. Thomas leaned back in his chair, hands folded, his expression carved into smug confidence. He allowed the faintest smirk to play across his lips as Cruise pressed him. "Mr. Cruise," Thomas said, his tone dripping with condescension, "this is not a movie. This is the Supreme Court of the United States. You are out of your depth." A ripple of chuckles ran through the chamber from those loyal to Thomas, but they quickly faded as Cruise refused to flinch. He stood tall, his gaze steady, his voice calm but cutting. "With all due respect, Justice Thomas, truth doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about robes or chairs or power. Truth either stands or it collapses under its own lies." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Thomas's smirk faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly, brushing off the statement with a wave of his hand. "Grand words, Mr. Cruise, but words are all they are. You are no authority here." Cruise didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His restraint itself became a weapon. "Authority means nothing if it's built on hypocrisy," he replied, eyes locked on Thomas. The crowd shifted uneasily. Even the reporters, scribbling notes, paused, their pens hovering mid-air. The back and forth continued, each exchange more loaded than the last. Thomas would try to undercut him with logic, with pedigree, with the kind of arrogance that had shielded him for decades. But Cruise never wavered, never let anger take over. Instead, he grew sharper, each response more precise, each point more dangerous to the carefully constructed armor Thomas had worn for years at one point. Thomas leaned forward, voice low but venomous. "You think because you can memorize lines, you can lecture me about integrity." His words echoed through the chamber like a dagger thrown in the dark. Cruise took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "No, Justice, I don't memorize lines. I live them. And the people in this room, the people watching outside are tired of living under yours." Gasps erupted. Thomas's face hardened, but his composure was beginning to crack. The audience leaned in, breaths held, waiting. The once unshakable Justice suddenly looked cornered, his confidence less like power and more like desperation. The tension reached a fever pitch. Reporters knew something seismic was coming, their cameras trained, their microphones poised. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the moment spiraling beyond control. Asterisk, the silence after Tom's challenge was deafening. For a heartbeat, no one dared to move. Clarence Thomas sat rigid, his robe draped over him like a shield. But his eyes betrayed something he rarely revealed out. Tom didn't pounce immediately. He let the silence linger, knowing that sometimes restraint is louder than rage. Then, with surgical precision, he began dismantling the Justice's carefully guarded facade. "Let's start with loyalty," Tom said, his voice low, measured, and dangerous. "A justice of the Supreme Court is supposed to serve the Constitution and the people. Yet you've allowed favors and gifts from billionaires to dictate your judgments. Vacations, yachts, private jets, things the average American can't even dream of affording. And while families struggle to pay rent, you sip champagne on borrowed wealth. Tell me, justice, is that the America you swore to protect? Gasps echoed through the chamber. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. A few murmurs rose from the backbenches, murmurs that quickly swelled into whispers. Thomas shifted in his seat, the smug mask beginning to crack. That is a gross oversimplification, he tried to interject, but Tom raised his hand, commanding silence. The audacity was stunning, an actor silencing a justice, and yet the courtroom obeyed. Next, Tom pressed on, his eyes blazing integrity. You claim to stand for the rule of law, but your record shows favoritism, contradictions, and political games you've hidden behind legal jargon, while real people, ordinary, hard-working citizens, pay the price for your decisions. You wear the robe like it makes you untouchable, but robes don't hide hypocrisy. They only drape it in black fabric. The room grew hotter, heavier, the weight of truth suffocating. Thomas opened his mouth, then shut it again. The words wouldn't come. His arrogance, the same shield that had protected him for decades, was failing him. Tom wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice softer now, but every syllable struck like a hammer. And finally, Anna, you talk about preserving the dignity of this institution, but dignity isn't preserved in silence. It isn't preserved by covering corruption with a smile. It's preserved by truth. And right now, Justice Thomas, the truth is that you have failed the very people you swore to serve. The line landed like an earthquake. For a moment, the entire chamber was frozen in stunned disbelief. Then the reaction came, wave by wave. Gasps turned into cries. Cries turned into applause. Some wiped tears from their eyes, unable to contain the swell of emotion. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in catharsis. Years of frustration, anger, and betrayal found a voice in Tom's words. Thomas sat slumped now, his earlier composure replaced by something alien to him. Vulnerability. His lips parted, as though searching for a rebuttal, but no words came. His hands trembled ever so slightly on the desk in front of him. The towering figure who once commanded silence with a glance was reduced to a shadow of himself. Tom, in contrast, stood taller than ever. The roles had reversed. The justice, once untouchable, looked cornered and small. The actor, once dismissed, now commanded the room like a general at the height of battle. The energy was palpable. Every camera lens zoomed in, every microphone strained to capture the words. Every heart pounded with the realization that they were witnessing something historic. It wasn't just an actor holding a justice accountable. It was a symbol of the people rising up against a broken system. Tom let the eruption continue for a few moments before lifting his hand. The room fell silent once again, as though everyone had collectively agreed he was now the authority. His eyes scanned the chamber, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a nation's fury and hope. You can dismiss me as just an actor. You can dismiss these people as unimportant, but you cannot dismiss the truth. And today, the truth is staring you in the face, and it will not go away. The applause that followed shook the walls. Tears streamed down faces. Even those who had entered skeptical found themselves swept into the tidal wave of conviction. And as Thomas sat in stunned silence, broken by a force he never anticipated, the gavel wasn't what sealed the moment. It was the sound of the people there. Gasps, their cries, their cheers. The courtroom may have fallen silent after Tom's mic drop moment, But outside those four walls, the world was anything but quiet. Within minutes, clips of his fiery counterattack began circulating across every social media platform. Someone had captured the exact moment Clarence Thomas stammered, his usually commanding voice swallowed by hesitation, and paired it with Tom's devastating words, "Robes don't hide hypocrisy." By the time the court adjourned, hashtags were already trending worldwide. Hashtag truth vs power, hashtag cruise control, hashtag justice on trial. TikTok was flooded with remixes Tom's words set to music, slow-motion edits of the crowd erupting, side-by-side comparisons of Thomas's past rulings against his current silence. Twitter, or X, as some insisted on calling it, was a battlefield of hot takes, memes, and rallying cries. Instagram Reels turned Tom's speech into motivational soundtracks, while Facebook groups turned it into a rallying point for activism. Cable news didn't wait for the nightly broadcast. CNN looped the confrontation on repeat, commentators nearly breathless as they declared it the courtroom moment of the century. Fox News scrambled to frame it as Hollywood grandstanding, but even their audience couldn't deny the sheer electricity of what had happened. MSNBC rolled out panel after panel, dissecting every syllable, every gesture. Celebrities weighed in to actors, musicians, athletes, people who rarely comment on politics, shared the clip with captions like "This is what courage looks like," and finally, someone said it. A-listers who had worked with Tom Cruise flooded the timeline with behind-the-scenes stories about his discipline, his fearlessness, his refusal to back down from impossible odds, linking the movie star's reputation to the moral warrior they had just witnessed. But the impact wasn't confined to entertainment. Politicians felt the tremors. Progressives hailed the speech as a turning point, demanding accountability from not just Clarence Thomas, but from the entire system that had enabled him. Conservatives, rattled, struggled to contain the narrative, some dismissing it as Hollywood theatrics, others quietly admitting off the record that Tom's words had landed harder than any Senate hearing in years. On college campuses, students organized impromptu rallies, holding up signs that read "Truth over power" and "Cruise for justice." High school debate teams referenced the speech in arguments, treating it like a modern-day Gettysburg Address. In coffee shops, offices, and barbershops, the conversation wasn't about sports or the weather anymore. It was about what one man had dared to say in a room where truth had long been smothered by formality, and the ripple effects spread even further. Late-night hosts built entire monologues around the confrontation. Podcasters called it a paradigm shift. Even corporate brands, ever eager to ride a wave, tweeted vague platitudes about courage, dignity, and truth without daring to mention names, but clearly inspired by the cultural shockwave Tom had unleashed. The irony was undeniable. A Hollywood star, often dismissed as shallow, had managed to do what generations of politicians, journalists, and insiders had failed to accomplish. He had cracked the armor of an untouchable justice, and, in doing so, he had touched a nerve in the American psyche. But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people. The single mother in Detroit who posted, "For once, I felt like someone was standing up for me." The veteran in Texas who wrote, "We fought for freedom overseas, and Tom reminded us we need to fight for it here too." The young student in California who said, "This is the reason I want to study law." It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a mirror held up to America, forcing the nation to confront its contradictions: privilege versus accountability, silence versus truth, corruption versus courage, And as the days turned into weeks, the wave didn't recede. Instead, it built into something larger, a movement that no headline, no pundit, no justice could contain. As the storm of headlines, hashtags, and heated debates began to settle into something deeper, Tom himself stepped forward, not to bask in the glory, not to claim victory, but to redirect the spotlight. For him, the confrontation with Clarence Thomas was never about personal triumph or cinematic bravado. It was about a principle as old as civilization itself, that truth must never cower before deception, and dignity must always rise above hypocrisy. In interviews, Tom refused to indulge in self-congratulation. "This isn't about me," he told one journalist, his voice steady, his tone resolute. "It's about the kind of society we want to live in. One where power can hide behind silence and corruption, or one where even the smallest voice can demand accountability." His words carried the same weight outside the courtroom as they had inside it, reminding millions that justice wasn't a performance, but a responsibility. The lesson was unmistakable. Power without integrity collapses, no matter how high the pedestal. Hypocrisy, no matter how carefully dressed in robes or authority, will eventually be unmasked. And courage, even from a single individual, can ignite a fire that spreads far beyond their own circle. Tom reframed the event into something universal. It wasn't about Hollywood versus Washington. It wasn't about celebrity clashing with institution. It was about the timeless battle between truth and lies, courage and cowardice, justice and corruption. The courtroom moment became a parable, a story parents told their children, teachers used in lessons, activists wielded in speeches. What resonated most was not Tom's celebrity, but his humanity. He had walked into a room stacked against him, faced a man who wielded untouchable power, and refused to flinch. That act of standing tall, of refusing to bow, gave ordinary people permission to do the same in their own lives, whether against corrupt bosses, unjust systems, or personal betrayals. The cultural echo wasn't just noise, it became a standard. Politicians were reminded that dignity is more powerful than rhetoric. Citizens remembered that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and young people, who had grown cynical watching institutions fail them, saw a living example that truth, spoken with courage, still matters. And as the narrative crystallized, one line, Tom's final crescendo, became the inscription of the moment, etched into history. When dignity stands against deception, it doesn't just win the room, it wins history. That was the moral carved out of confrontation. Not the triumph of a man, but the triumph of values that endure when systems crumble. In the end, Tom Cruise didn't just dismantle a justice, he reminded the world that justice itself only survives when ordinary people choose truth over lies, courage over fear, and dignity over corruption. And so, the title came full circle. Clarence Thomas lost it not because of Tom Cruise's fame, or the theatrics of a courtroom showdown, but because truth has a way of breaking through the strongest walls of hypocrisy. When deception is confronted with courage, it cracks, it crumbles, and it exposes itself for what it always was, fragile. In that moment, Tom wasn't just an actor. He became a symbol of leaders who refuse silence, a reminder that integrity is louder than intimidation, that courage is stronger than corruption, and that even in a world where power often shields itself, one determined voice can shake the system. This wasn't about Hollywood. This wasn't about politics. It was about all of us, about what we're willing to tolerate and what we're willing to challenge. If Tom's unscripted performance proved anything, It's that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to look away from injustice. That is where you come in. Because this moment doesn't end in a courtroom. It carries on every time someone chooses to speak up, to question, to call out the hypocrisy in their own world. If you believe that hypocrisy must always be exposed, don't let this moment fade. Share this video, subscribe to this channel, join the movement of voices that refuse to stay silent. Because when dignity takes a stand against deception, it doesn't just win the room, it wins history. And history is still being written. The only question is, will you be part of it?